In this video we're going to take a look at generic foreign keys in Django. Now in the previous video we looked at the content types framework and we looked at the content type model that's provided by that framework that allows you to look up any other model in the Django application. In this one we're going to look at generic foreign keys, and these allow you to add a foreign key from any of the models that you have in your application to the content type model. And this allows your model to effectively tie itself to any other class in the Django application. Let's dive in and we're going to see how to do that now. Now I'm going to start by referencing the documentation for Django for generic relations. So when you add a foreign key from a model in your application to the content type model, this is going to allow you to connect your model to any other model class in the application, and that's what Django does with the permission model, for example. We'll see that later in the video. And when you use the content type as a foreign key, you can enable these truly generic, and these are also called polymorphic, relationships between models. Now I'm going to scroll down to this code section and I'm going to make this smaller so that these appear on one line. And we're going to see how this works using this code, and then we'll build a practical example. Now what we have here is a model called tagged item, and the idea here is that you might want to add a tag to any number of other models in the application. For example, a movie might have tags, a user might have tags that they've applied to themselves, and so on. You might have tags for multiple models. So what you can do is provide a generic foreign key. So how do you do that? First of all, you define a few fields here. The first one is called content type, and that's a foreign key to the content type model that we saw in the previous video, which should be appearing on the screen now. And the content type field will therefore link the model that we have here to that content type model. And then we also have an object ID field. And the object ID is a positive integer field. And when we link this model to a particular content type, the object ID field is going to be a number that tells this particular model which instance of that model do we want to fetch. And the final thing we have is a field called content object, and that is a generic foreign key which we've imported at the top from django.contrib.contenttypes.fields. So we have a generic foreign key field here, and we pass in the reference to the content type and the object ID fields that we define above that in this model. So let's now move on, and we're going to look at a practical example here. Let's go to VS Code where I have the project open, and we have a script here, and we have a models.py file that contains some models. We're going to create a new model in the app called comment that stores user comments in this imaginary system. And we want to be able to associate a comment with restaurants. So for example, a user goes to a restaurant and they write a comment about that restaurant. And we also want to maybe associate a comment with a particular rating. So we have a rating model. We may want to add comments underneath the rating. So we need the comment model that we're about to create to be able to reference either one of those models as the parent foreign key. And we're going to use a generic foreign key for that. So what I'm going to do is scroll to the bottom of this models file, and I'm actually going to remove the dummy model that we had in the previous video, and we're going to replace that with a new model called comment that will inherit from the Django model class. And a comment, of course, it contains text, and we're going to set that equal to a models.text field. And then we need to add the reference to that content type, and that's going to be a foreign key to the content type model in Django that we saw in the previous video. And when we delete a model, we want that to cascade, so models.cascade. Now I will import the content type model in a second. We also need the object ID here, and that's going to be a models.positive small integer field. That's going to track the actual instance ID that we're connecting the comment to for the given content type. And the final field we need to add is the content object, and that's going to be an instance of the generic foreign key. And again, we're going to import this in a second, but like the documentation, we need to pass the reference to the content type as the first parameter, and the name of the field that we used, and the standard name is content type, so we pass that in there. And we also pass in the object ID so that Django will then know which particular instance of that content type to fetch. And then once we've done that at the top, I'm going to import the two objects that we're using. So from the fields module in the content types framework, we're importing generic foreign key, and from the models, we will import the content type model. So let's save this, and I'm going to go back down to the comment model. So again, let's highlight that we have a foreign key to the content type model, and that's the model that tracks all of the other models that we have in the Django application, which will allow us to link this comment to any other model. And to know which instance that we're linking it to, we have the object ID. And as far as the generic foreign key goes, we're going to see what benefits that provides later in the video. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the admin.py file in this Django application, and we've already registered a bunch of models in this file. What I'm going to do is register a new one for the comment model. And we're going to create some model admin subclasses here. So what I'm going to do for the restaurant model is create a new admin class called restaurant admin. That's going to inherit from admin.modelAdmin. And what we need to provide to that is a few fields here. Now I'm going to provide a list display field. So for a restaurant, we want to list out the ID of the restaurant and the name of the restaurant as well. And then we can add the restaurant admin as a second argument to admin.site.register. So we're passing that in to tell this function that we want to customize the admin for the restaurant model. I'm going to do the same for the rating model. So I'm going to copy this and we're going to call the class itself rating admin. And then we pass that into this rating model here. And we need to change the fields that we're referencing. The rating doesn't have a name field, but it does have a numerical rating field. Now the final thing I'm going to do is add a new admin class for the comment model that we've just imported at the top, and we're going to use this to see what those fields provide in a second. So let's create a class called comment admin, and we're going to inherit again from model admin, and we're going to add a list display to that, and I'm going to pass all of these fields in. So we have the text field for the actual text for that comment, and we also have the fields that we use to create the generic foreign key. Once we've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the make migrations command, and you can see that's created the new comment model and removed that dummy model that we had before. We can then run migrate to actually affect those changes to the database. So that's going to create the comment table. What I'm going to do after that is run the Django server, and we're going to go to the admin UI. So we're on the admin page. I'm going to go to the restaurants page here, and we can see now on the list display, which is this page, we get the ID and the name of the restaurant. Previously we just got the dunder string output, but now we have the ability to customize that and add as many fields as we want to this table. Now we need to access the comment model, and I've forgotten to register that, so let's copy this, and it's the comment admin that we need to add to admin.site.register. So we're registering the comment model and we're passing that custom admin class. If we now go back and refresh this, we can see the comments have appeared in the Django admin. And we can add a comment with this button at the top right, and let's say we're adding a review for a restaurant, so we could say really good food. Probably something more exciting would be good, but let's just go with that. And the content type, this is where we can actually link the comment to any other model in the application. We're going to link it to the core restaurant model, and we need to provide an object ID. So that's why I added the IDs to the list display. If we go to the restaurant page on a new tab, you can see the IDs for each of the restaurants. So what we need to do is we need to provide one of these IDs to this object ID field. So let's add that, and we're going to pass number 3 in here, and then we can save this, and we then get this output here. So we get the text, we also get the object ID and the content type, but for the content object, which if you remember was the instance of the generic foreign key field, for that particular field what we have is the text golden dragon, and that's the name of the restaurant. What this actually represents is essentially the object that's being represented by this generic foreign key. So this is an actual instance of the concrete model that's represented by this content type. So it's the restaurant with the ID of 3. What we can do is add another comment and say something like, I agree with this rating. And let's say that this comment is being added to a rating that was added to the database. So we have a core rating content type, and let's give this object ID of 2 here. If we hit save, we get back the second instance of this comment. But you can see now that that is actually applied this foreign key to a different underlying model than the original comment. So the original comment was to a restaurant. This one is to the rating content type, and the content object therefore will point to an actual rating in the database. So this structure allows you to apply, or allows you to add foreign keys generically from one class to any other class in your application, any other model class. And this allows you to create flexible relationships in your application where you can add links from one model to potentially any other model. Now what I'm going to do to demonstrate this further is we're going to query this using some code in Django. So let's go back to VS Code and go to ormscript.py. At the top we've imported the content type model. I'm also going to import the new comment model that we just created, and let me make the terminal smaller. Within the run method, what we're going to do is fetch all of the comments. So let's run the query comment.objects.all. That will give us back all of the comments, and then we can look over them. So for comment and comments, what we can do is print out comment, and then we need a field here. We can access a field for each comment. What I want to print out, just so that we can see this, is the content object. So let's save this, and if we go back to models.py, remember the content object, that's the actual instance of this generic foreign key field. So we can save this, we can stop the server and make the terminal bigger here. And I'm going to run python manage.py run script, and we pass the ORM script into this, and we're going to get the output here. And we can see we have the restaurant on line 1 and the rating on line 2. And we can look at the type of each of these. So if I check the type of each of these instances, we can see we get back the actual underlying model. It's not the content type model that represents the class. This is the actual instance of one of these classes. Now let's move on. We're going to see how Django takes a comment object, and then it finds the correct instance for this content object. So remember, the content object can be any other model in the application. We want to find out how Django can take the comment and look that up correctly to get the correct relationship. So at the top, I'm going to change the code a little bit, and we're going to run the query comment.objects.first, and we'll rename the variable comment because we're only fetching one comment. And what we can do is get the stored content type. So in order to get that, what we can do is print comment.content type, not content object, which is the generic foreign key. This time we're printing the content type. And then I'll add another comment here. From the content type that we have above, we can fetch the associated generic foreign key instance. So what I'm going to do actually is pull out the content type into a variable called 𝗤type. So that's going to be comment.content type. And we can change the print statement below that to print that out. And from that content type model instance, we can then look up the actual concrete model using a method that we saw in the last video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called model, and it's going to be equal to the content type instance, and we're going to call the function getObject for this type. And this is similar to the model.objects.get function that you would use to look up a single instance of a model. For this function though, it's going to take the parameters that we pass in here, and it's going to look up the model associated with the content type. So what we need to pass in here is a primary key for the related model, and we're going to set that equal to the object ID. So the comment that we pulled out from the database, that has that object ID field that represents the ID of the instance that we're linking the model to. We can pass that in as a lookup with the primary key field to this get object for this type function, and then we can print the model to the terminal. And we can also print the type of the model as well, just so we can see what the actual type of that returned model is. So let's now run this and see what kind of output we get. First of all, we get the content type printed out, and then we get the actual instance printed out, and that instance is coming from this function here. We take the content type, we look up the object for that type, and remember the content type represents the restaurant model in this case, so the lookup parameters that we pass in here, they are actually going to be passed into the restaurant lookup. And that's going to give us back a single instance of the restaurant model, and that's what we see here in this output. And we also get the type here, and we can see it's an instance of the restaurant model. So that is the code that's kind of run behind the scenes in Django, but this can be simplified by just defining a generic foreign key. When you define the generic foreign key and pass the content type and the object ID references in, Django will abstract away all of these lookups, so we can remove all of this code. And to get access to the related field, instead we can just call comment, or rather just reference comment.content_object. And if we run that on the terminal, we get back the instance of the restaurant in this case, but this will work for any other type. So for example, the second and the last comment that we had in the database was for a rating. If we run this again, we get back the instance of the rating, and we can get to that just by accessing this content object field that we defined on the model, and we made that a generic foreign key. Now we can also programmatically create a comment by just referencing the content object and not worrying about the content type and the object ID fields. Let's see an example of what I mean now. We're back in the ORM script.py, and at the top here what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a restaurant out from the database, and that's going to be restaurant.objects.first, and I need to import the restaurant model at the top. So we have a restaurant, and let's say we want to add a comment to that particular restaurant. I'm going to change this line of code here. Instead of comment.objects.last, let's call the .create function. we're going to create a new comment in the database, and we need some text for that comment. So let's add some text here, awful restaurant. And in order to link this comment to the restaurant through the generic foreign key, we can actually just pass the content object in here and link that to the restaurant that we pulled out on the line above. We can then print that to the terminal just below here, and I'm also going to print the instance dictionary here, so comment.__dictionary. If we save that, we can then run the application on the terminal. So I'm going to run this and let's see what output we get. So we get a new comment object, but if we look at the fields that have been added, we can see the text for awful restaurant, but we also have the content type ID and the object ID. So Django has automatically filled that in to create the generic foreign key. All we need to do is, to the field that we define the generic foreign key on, we need to pass the instance of the other model that we want to connect it to. So it's very easy once you have a generic foreign key to link other objects to that model. You can just pass the instance in and it will do all of the work under the hood. Let's now move on to reverse generic relations. Now, to begin with, at the moment we have a generic foreign key from the comment model to any other model. That can be done, that can be applied to any other model in the application. Now, typically when you have these generic relations, you have a core set of models in mind that you want to connect this model to. And for us, a comment belongs either to a restaurant or a rating. Now, if you know which set of models are typically going to be the parent in the generic foreign key, we can add a generic relation on those parent models, and that allows them to link back to the comments. So for example, we could take an instance of a restaurant and then find all of the comments for that restaurant using the generic relation. So let's do that right now. We're going to go to the top and import from the fields module the generic relation. And we're going to add to both the restaurant and the rating model another field, and that's going to be a generic relation called comments. So we're going to make an instance of that generic relation, and what we need to pass in here is the name of the model class that we want to be the other side of that relation. And that's going to be the comment model, so we can copy this and bring it down also to the rating model. So we're going to add that new field in both restaurant and rating. After we do that, we can then query from these parent models to get all of the associated comments. So let's go back to 𝗰script.py, and what we're going to do is we're going to get a particular restaurant from the database. And we can do that with the .get function. And I'm going to go back to the Django admin now, and I'm going to go to the restaurants page. Now we have the IDs for all of the restaurant. We need to find a restaurant that has comments in order to do this example. So let's go to the comments page, and we have two comments that belong to the restaurant model, and the object ID is 4 and 3. So let's get the one associated with the ID of 3. So we're going to get the restaurant using the .get function. We pass the primary key of 3 in. And what we're going to do now is we're going to fetch all of the comments for this restaurant. Now, because we've added that generic relation, we can get all of the comments, and let's create a variable called comments, simply by referencing the restaurant and then following that generic relation, which, remember, we created the field called comments, and we can then call .all. That's going to give us back all of these comments, and then we can print them out to the terminal. So let's stop the Django server and run this script. And you can see we get back a query set containing all of the comments that are linked to that restaurant. And under the hood, that is going to use the generic foreign key that we have, but it's going to look on the reverse side of the relation from the parent model to get all of the child models. And if we start the server and go back to the Django admin here and go to this particular comment with the ID of 4, I'm going to change that to 3 and then save this. So now we have two comments that are associated with the restaurant with ID of 3. We can go back to the terminal, stop this again and rerun the script, and this time we're going to get back a query set containing 2 comments. So we now have this link between the restaurant and all of its comments, and this is similar to a many-to-many manager in a way. You can also add and remove comments using that generic relation. So for example, to add comments for this restaurant, I'm going to change .all to the .add function, again similar to a many-to-many manager, and then to that we can pass in an instance of a comment. So I'm just going to create one dynamically here, comment.objects.create, and let's give the comment some text, and I'm just going to say text1. And then in order to create the comment, we can also pass the content object that it's related to, and in this case that's going to be the restaurant that we pulled out with the ID of 3. And we don't need the variable comments here. I'm going to remove that, and we're just going to comment this print statement out and save that. We can then rerun the script, and that is going to dynamically add a new comment to the set of comments that are associated with the restaurant. And under the hood, The generic relation is going to take care of creating this comment, linking it to the restaurant, and setting up the correct content type and object ID references. Now if we go back to the Django admin and refresh this page, we can see we now have another comment that's been added to this page, and again it's linked to a restaurant with the ID of 3. And just like the many-to-many manager, we can actually do other operations on this generic relation from the parent to the child. So for example, we can get the number of comments associated with a restaurant with the restaurant.comments.count function, and I'm going to print that to the terminal. And let's say we wanted to get the last comment for this restaurant and remove it from the database. Let's see how to do that now. We're going to create a variable called last comment, and that's going to be equal to restaurant.comments.last. Once we have that, we can then use the restaurant model, and we can use that generic relation to the comments, and we can call the .remove method. We need to pass an instance in to remove a comment, so we're going to pass the instance for the last comment, and then just to make sure that's been deleted, I'm going to replicate the call to .count, and we're going to print that to the terminal. And then let's run this, and hopefully we're going to see that the count goes down by 1, and we do see that. We started off with 3 comments and we finished with 2, and that's because we removed a comment using this remove method that's defined on the generic relation. Now we can also add a related name to our generic relations. I'm just going to show an example of that, and then I'm sure you'll understand how that's done. So I'm going to go up to the restaurant model. We have a generic relation for the restaurant model, but we can add another keyword argument here called related query name. And this can be used in filtering statements, as we're going to see now. So let's add a related name here of restaurant. The comment can be associated with a single restaurant, so we'll keep that in the singular form. And I'm going to save this, and we're going to see how to use this now by going back to the script. And I'm actually just going to remove all of this code. And what we're going to do is create a variable called comments, and that's going to be equal to the comment model. We're going to use the .objects.filter method. So we're going to filter down these comments, and let's say we wanted to get only comments that were associated with Indian restaurants. Now if we look at the comment model, we can see we have a content object, and that represents an instance of the associated model. But the question is, how would we filter these comments to only get Indian restaurants? What's the easy way to do that? Now that we've added to the restaurant model this related query name of restaurant, we can actually reference that in the .filter statement. So I'm going to pass that in, restaurant, and remember that's not a field on the comment model, that's a related query name. And then we can filter that down further by following that reference to the restaurant and then filtering to the restaurant type. And we're going to make that equal to the restaurant's type choices.Indian field. We can then print those comments to the terminal. Now I'm not sure we have any comments associated with Indian restaurants, so this might return an empty query set. But if we go back to the Django admin, you can see that the 2 comments for our restaurants are attached to a restaurant called Golden Dragon, which is a Chinese restaurant. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to change the Indian reference to Chinese here, and hopefully when we run the script now, we're going to get back the 2 comments that are tied to that particular restaurant type. So in the .filter statements, we can reference the related query name simply by defining a generic relation on the other side of the generic foreign key, and then passing a related query name into that we can make equal to a string, where we can then use that in our .filter method to filter down the comments by that particular parent class. Now as a final example, let's see how to create generic relations in the Django admin interface. Let's start the server and go back to the Django admin, and I'm going to go to the restaurants page here, and if we click add restaurant, you can see we get back this form containing all of the fields for the restaurant, but we don't have an option here of adding any comments. So the comment, even though there's a generic relation from the restaurant back to the comments, we don't have the ability to add those comments here in the admin, but we're going to show how we can do that now. What we can do is we can add these comments inline by creating something called a tabular inline class in the Django admin. And there's a page I'm going to reference here on using generic relations as an inline. I'll link that below the video. And if we scroll down here, we get the snippet of code that we can add to the admin.py file. And I'm going to copy this import. From the content types.admin module, we have this generic tabular inline class. Let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to minimize the terminal, and I'm going to open the admin.py file. And at the top of this, let's import that generic tabular inline class. And what I'm going to do just at the top here is I'm going to create a comment inline model. And that's going to inherit from that generic tabular inline. And what we need to do is provide a model to this class. So it's going to be the comment model, and we can provide a maximum number of related instances to create in the form. I'm going to set that equal to 1 for now. Once we've created the comment inline, we can go down to the restaurant admin model class. So we've already added a list display field, but we can add another field to this model, to this class rather, called inlines, and we're going to set that equal to a list containing that single comment inline class that we created just above here. And this inlines field, this can be added to any admin class where it makes sense for a comment to be added as a child for that class. Now, what's the effect of adding the inlines to the restaurant admin? Let's go back to the Django admin now and back to the add restaurant form. If I refresh this page, we're going to see a new widget at the bottom that allows us to add a comment. So when we add a new restaurant, that's going to create the restaurant in the database and give it a particular ID. And then we can create the comment inline, and Django is automatically going to fill in those details to create the generic foreign key. For example, it's going to tie it to the restaurant content type, and it's going to set the object ID to the new object ID created for this new restaurant in the database. So if you need to add some generic relations in the Django admin, you can import this generic tabular inline, create a class and tie it to a particular model. And then within your parent class admin, you can then create an inline and add your inline to that list. And we can also change the maximum number of potential comments to be added here. So if I set that equal to 4 and go back to the page, if we refresh this page, now we can see we get 4 of these. So you can customize these inline admin classes as you wish. So that's the end of the practical examples. What I'm going to do to finish the video is look at the Django permission system, and we're going to see how Django's permissions framework uses content types and generic foreign keys. So let's look at this page of the documentation, which I'll leave a link to in the video notes. We have a page on permissions and authorization. So Django has a built-in permission system, and it provides a way to assign permissions to specific users and groups of users. Now, Django comes with a set of default permissions. If we scroll down here, we can see these default permissions. So when you have the auth module listed in installed apps, Django is going to ensure that there are 4 default permissions. So we have the add permission, the change permission, delete, and view permission. And these are created for each Django model in your installed applications. And the permissions will be created when you run the migrate command. And we can see these by opening up the database browser for SQLite. And I have that open, and we have a page here for the auth permission models. So if I browse that table, you can see we have all of these permissions in this database table. And for each model, we have an add, a change, a delete, and a view permission. Now, something to notice in this table is this column here. You can see that we have, for each permission, a link to a content type ID. So what is that exactly? Let's go back to the database structure, and we're going to right click the auth permission table, and I'm going to go to modify table so we can have a look. So the content type ID here, it's a foreign key to the Django content type table. So when we go back to the data in that table, for this particular permission, let's say the add group permission, we have a content type ID of 3. And if we go back to the Django content type table here, we can see that that links to the content type associated with the group model. Now, how does Django link a particular user to a particular permission? Let's go back to the database structure, and we're going to look at this table here. It's called auth user permissions. Let's right click that and browse the table, and you can see that this has a few columns. So there's a user ID column. That's simple. It's a foreign key to the auth user table. And we also have a permission ID as well, and that's a foreign key to the permission table, which is this one here. And each permission has a content type ID. So if you assign a permission that's linked to a user, that permission is applied to a particular model in the Django application, and that's done through this content type ID, which links the permission to its parent content type. And this structure allows us to link these permissions to users, and it allows a flexible system where different users can have different permissions for different models in the application. Now, I'm not going to show a practical example of this now, but if you're interested, leave a comment below the video and we can maybe make a dedicated video to the Django permission system. Let us know if that's something you're interested in, but I'm just wanting to show the structure of these database tables and how you can flexibly link a permission to a user, and that permission that you're linking can also be tied to a particular model class. Now that's all for this video. Thanks very much for watching. A bit of a technical topic this, but it's very useful to understand how you can link one model in your Django application to any other model in the application. Please give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and we'll see you in the next video.